September 28, 1955 started as a normal day for Calgarians. Men went to work, children to school, and housewives hunted for bargains on canned food at Shop Easy Jewel. But just after 10:50 a.m., civil defense authorities in Calgary started receiving word from radar stations in the Arctic that Russian bombers had been spotted and were on course for the city. Calgary Mayor Don McKay acted quickly. Air raid sirens blared out warnings across the city, and radio stations announced an evacuation order: leave or be obliterated by an atomic bomb. Thousands fled to outlying communities in what was, at the time, one of the largest evacuations of a major Canadian city. The fallout from the nuclear strike was grim. The single hydrogen bomb hit its target near the intersection of 8th Avenue and Center Street with deadly accuracy. Those attempting to flee the incoming barrage were met with walls of traffic and were caught up in the carnage that left them and thousands of their fellow Calgarians dead. At least, that might have been the outcome, according to defense officials, who planned and executed Operation Lifesaver, a practice run of an evacuation of Calgary should the city ever fall under nuclear attack. Of course, there was no hydrogen bomb dropped on Calgary on September 28th of 1955, and by the end of that day, everyone was safely back in their homes. The simulated attack was part of a civil defense exercise designed to understand what evacuating a Canadian city might look like in the face of an incoming Soviet air assault. The plan was first announced to the public in February of 1955, but preparations for the exercise started long before. The man in charge of planning was Colonel G.O. Bell, who, after having witnessed the destruction of German cities in the Second World War and noticing how civilian populations had been casualties of large-scale Allied bombing, argued that a small amount of preparation and training would be vital to a military victory should Canada ever be involved in a global nuclear war. Bell moved to Calgary from England in 1953, and after being named the Director of Civil Defense for the city of Calgary, he took his role extremely seriously. Bell was a passionate advocate for civil defense preparedness. Throughout 1953, he spoke to various groups around Calgary on the need for civil defense preparation. To the aptly named Optimist Club in October of that year, he told members that Calgary deserves better than, quote, burning down while its citizens play golf. Before Operation Lifesaver, Bell had previously organized a small-scale exercise in the case of a conventional attack against Calgary in 1954, and by all accounts it was a success. But the scale of Operation Lifesaver would be massive by comparison. By early 1955, Colonel Bell had decided that Northeast Calgary would be the practice area for the evacuation, and he hoped as many as 30,000 residents would participate. Thousands of pamphlets were printed and distributed to residents explaining the need for the exercise, which was followed by a house-to-house canvassing to address any questions residents might have. In mid-May of 1955, Colonel Bell and his team began releasing details of the evacuation plan to the public. While the plans were being discussed, many Calgarians were of the opinion that Calgary wasn't important enough to warrant an atomic bomb strike. The population of the city at the time was less than 200,000 people, and with the first discoveries of oil in Alberta happening less than a decade prior in 1947, the strategic importance of Calgary was thought to be minuscule. But Colonel Bell was adamant, telling the Calgary Albertan on May 5, 1955, quote, "The people of Nagasaki never dreamed they were important enough for an A-bomb. The point is that we might get one." There were also concerns about why the blue-collar northeast section of the city was chosen for the exercise, as opposed to the more affluent western quarters of the city. It would be interesting to know where the persons who decided that the northeast residents of our city were to be the guinea pigs for the evacuation live themselves, wrote one Calgary Herald reader in a letter to the editor. But Colonel Bell, always a fervent believer in the need for civil defense planning, responded in another letter to the editor later that week, saying that the Northeast was the best option given its unique characteristics, and that both he and the mayor of Calgary reside in the Northeast themselves. Despite the detractors, the plan was widely endorsed by political and community leaders. The Albertan published an editorial encouraging residents to participate and supporting the plan. So going into the summer of 1955, Operation Lifesaver, as it was officially named at the end of May, was all systems go. The evacuation would take place on September 21st. Throughout the summer, preparations continued, with volunteers being recruited and trained, and experts from the U.S. and other NATO-allied countries making plans to come to Calgary to observe. As September approached, more and more of the details of Operation Lifesaver became public. It was revealed that the sirens signaling the start of the exercise would not sound before 10 a.m., and canvassers reported that up to 92% of residents affected said they intended to participate. Towns outside the theoretical blast zone were selected and prepared for an influx of evacuees, including Penhold, Trochu, Drumheller, and Rockyford. Pub owners in those towns were especially looking forward to the exercise, anticipating their best sales day of the year. Some of the towns even saw the exercise as a chance to entice Calgarians back for future visits. The mayor of Drumheller, W.H.D. Anderson, said that those evacuees sent to Drumheller could enjoy a tour of the Badlands during their sojourn, as well as coffee and donuts. As the summer went on, plans were finalized, tests of the sirens were conducted, calls for more volunteers went out, and the small towns around Calgary prepared for the arrival of rehearsing refugees. Arrangements were made for RCMP from Regina to patrol the evacuated areas of the city and control traffic. Newspaper announcements were published to remind residents of what to do on the 21st of September when the sirens blared out across the city. And by the weekend before the exercise was scheduled, most plans were in place. There was still a shortage of private cars needed to ferry evacuees with no other transportation options, but most everything else was on track. And finally, the big day came. Residents were prepared, reminders were printed in the newspapers, and deliveries from the Bay were rescheduled to the 22nd. But in perhaps the most Calgary thing ever, the exercise had to be postponed for 1 week due to an unforeseen and severe snow and windstorm, the worst one in 5 years according to the Herald, and that would have put evacuees in unnecessary danger. It was decided that the exercise would be moved ahead 1 week to September 28th, which increased calls to cancel the exercise altogether. Organizations and volunteers scrambled to adjust to the new date, as well as outside organizations that had events planned for the new evacuation date. Highway conditions were still treacherous in the days leading up to the 28th, once again calling into question whether the evacuation would or should proceed. This photo of Highway 1 east of Calgary shows how bad the conditions were. As late as September 26th, only 2 days before the new evacuation date, it was still uncertain whether conditions would be good enough to execute the plan. There were weather forecasts calling for more rain on the 28th, and there was no way of knowing whether roads that were drenched by melting snow and mud would be clear enough to be used. Alderman P.N.R. Morrison blasted the plan to move forward with Operation Lifesaver, accusing Colonel Bell and his deputy, Air Vice Marshal George R. Howsam, of rank incompetence, an assessment Colonel Bell said was bereft of any fact. Despite the setbacks, by the 27th, rural road crews rallied and managed to clear most of the routes needed to get Operation Lifesaver back on track. Headlines in the papers published the day before the exercise announced that Operation Lifesaver was on. And on the morning of the 28th, just before 10:50 a.m., the siren sounded and Operation Lifesaver was underway. But as it turned out, not everyone who lived or worked in the evacuation area participated in the exercise. It was estimated that only 10,000 people took part, which was only a third of the 30,000 expected, with some even ignoring the exercise outright on the orders of their bosses to continue working. Despite the lower than expected participation rate, by mid-afternoon the organizers had considered the mock evacuation a success, noting that traffic was running smoothly and reception areas in the outlying communities reported high spirits and even a festive atmosphere. The following day, newspapers were filled with stories and photos of the drill, but despite this being a fake war, there was at least one real casualty. As part of the exercise, some practice mortar bombs were detonated in the Crescent Heights community to add to the warlike atmosphere. A malfunction with one of the mortar's fuses sent Rifleman Roy Brown of Jamaica to hospital with burns to his face and hands. His two comrades, who were standing only feet from him at the time, Rifleman Jack McDonald and Sergeant E.H. Vardy, both of Calgary, were uninjured. Rifleman Brown seems to have been the only participant to have suffered any significant injuries during the exercise. City police and RCMP on the highways reported no traffic accidents or property crime during the evacuation. However, shortly after the all-clear siren sounded, a burglar did make off with 2 pairs of earrings from the home of Mr. Peter Morgan of 7th Avenue Northeast. Low participation from Calgarians meant that efforts put in by the surrounding townspeople were somewhat for naught. The town of Strathmore, for example, expected and prepared for 2,500 visitors, but only about 300 arrived. They were served coffee and sandwiches, and while activities were planned, many left before the all-clear was given by civil defense officials. There was, as a result, a surplus of sandwiches that organizers were attempting to distribute to keep them from going to waste. 126 reporters, photographers, and radio journalists covered Operation Lifesaver, according to the Herald, including a film crew from the National Film Board of Canada. Despite the exercise being declared a success, there were still detractors in its aftermath, including once again Alderman Morrison, who said there was no doubt the operation was a failure. Newspaper reader D.M. Sewell suggested that instead of trying to evacuate, Calgarians should opt to, quote, die at home in the case of an atomic attack, and decried Operation Lifesaver as silly business. And in a scandalous bit of politicking, mayoral candidate Gordon Ray called the exercise, and excuse my language here, but I am quoting, poppycock, holding up this page of the Calgary Albertan and saying that the newspaper men who wrote and published it were mentally deranged. And as a former newspaper man myself, let me just say that Mr. Ray's assessment of newspaper journalists, both past and present, is 100% accurate. As for the lasting impact of Operation Lifesaver on the city of Calgary, There really isn't one. Newspaper mentions of the exercise trail off after December of 1955, and a newsreel of the event playing at the Uptown Theater earlier that year in October got very low billing behind Joseph Cotten and Eva Bartok and their film Special Delivery. And anyway, only 3 short years after Operation Lifesaver in 1958, the Soviet Union deployed its first intercontinental ballistic missiles capable of dropping a nuclear warhead on any city in North America in less than 1 hour, rendering any evacuation plan on the scale of Operation Lifesaver completely moot. This uplifting film, produced by the National Film Board in 1983, basically concludes that if a nuclear attack is launched from the Soviet Union, there would be no hope of survival for city-dwelling Canadians.
Everyone in the downtown area would be killed instantly, vaporized.
As for Colonel Bell, he left his civil defense role in May of 1968 and began working for the Calgary Emergency Measures Organization, where he planned and executed an exercise to test the efficiency of Rocky View Hospital, in which 38 students of Bishop Grandin High School participated in a simulated boiler explosion. The last record of a G.O. Bell in Calgary I could find was a letter to the editor published in the Calgary Herald in 1980, and I can't even confirm that it's Colonel Bell who wrote it, but based on what I learned about the man and his quotes published in city newspapers, its tone does seem consistent. I did find this obituary from 1981, which seems to describe his life and match his first initials, but I have no real way to confirm this is him, and I couldn't track down an obituary for the person listed as Joffrey Oswald Bell's wife, so the ultimate fate of Colonel Bell remains, to me at least, unconfirmed. Operation Lifesaver had the most noble of intentions, and despite its detractors and its low participation rate, seemed to be a successful exercise, even though the accelerated pace of weapons development at the beginning of the Cold War meant it was ultimately futile. But going back over these news articles and photographs, I was inspired to see how Alberta communities work together to pull off this incredible feat of logistics that's hard to imagine even in this day and age. And maybe that story of fellowship and cooperation is legacy enough. Thank you so much for watching. You can check out some of my other Calgary-related content here. Don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you next time.